Okay. Did you log in?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I can type that password. Oh, you can put us on there. That's on that.
Let's make a few changes to the slides because everything isn't fitting in. Or some text cropping out. So
Yeah.
just resized a few things and made a few things, repositioned a few others.
Oh, yeah.
I started working on it, so. Couple of slides. Michael.
Hello, hello.
So, where's your drive? Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks.
A couple of things. The
Okay.
limit as far as the camera can see is somewhere around this blue line over here and that blue line at that end.
In front, right? In front of the blue line?
Yeah, you can be in front of it. That's
Okay.
right there. You'll be able to see what you look like because I'm using my computer's camera for Zoom.
Okay.
So you can see how far you're going. That's the microphone. It's omnidirectional, so
Oh,
it'll
great.
capture you pretty well as long as you don't go like 10 meters away.
I definitely won't go that far.
As you want the slides to run, you can indicate to me that you want the next slide, just say slide or
Okay.
next or something, and I'll just run that.
Okay.
That's it.
Yeah, whatever's easiest, or if you want to give me a mouse or something, it doesn't matter.
That's fine. I'll
Whatever
do
you
it.
think the flow will go. I'm glad I could be here in person. I have to tell you, it's been a long time since I've been in front of people talking. Or at least it feels like it. Or at least talking to people in this type of setting.
I think Marianne wants to do it.
Yeah, the agroforestry info, we have some here. Pick it up whenever you'd like. You're looking for some to sleep at night if you want to peruse a economic analysis I did for an organic farm in eastern Massachusetts for a couple of agroforestry practices. You're more than welcome to look at net present value and land equivalency value and a variety of other economic analysis. It's good to see people use chalk still.
Yeah, they just don't have any. There are some, there's covered in land here.
Yeah.
Down, inaccessible. Yeah, then they leave it up so you can puzzle through it. Ready? Oh, thank you. It's all set?
Yeah, we're good.
Great. And we're going?
Yep.
Okay, good morning. Welcome to ThinkFOOD. This is our 8th annual conference. I'm Marianne Tebben. I'm the director of the Center for Food Studies at Simon's Rock. I'm happy to have you all here virtually and in person. And we're really happy to have Mike Downey here to talk to us about agroforestry. And he's coming to us from the Massachusetts Bureau of Forest, Fire Control and Forestry, where he's the Forest Stewardship Program Coordinator. And he has lots of information to share with us about agroforestry. And I want to let you know there will be time for questions after, both in person and on Zoom. So feel free to share your questions anytime you like. So thank you, Mike, for being here, and we'll let you take it away.
Oh, it's great to be back in Berkshire County. Berkshire County is a really special place for me personally, as well as my family. My 3 children were born here, and I spent many years living in Peru. So it's not very often I get back, unfortunately, but it's great to see friends like Tom Ryan and Jeff Jourdain, which will be speaking a little bit more in detail about Civil Pasture. But I do want to start with just kind of my background. I started passionately being involved in agroforestry a little over 20 years ago when I started working down in Kentucky as a service forester. And I'm hoping to bring some of that passion here this morning. I'm hoping to bring at least some of the knowledge that I have, which is primarily focused on riparian buffer strips and windbreaks. That's kind of where my expertise lays. However, what really excites me about agroforestry is the interdisciplinary approach that science takes, where we're taking on the farm problems and looking at them holistically from a tree and agricultural base to hopefully solve that for the farmer and provides some better benefits down the road. Anytime you introduce trees into the agricultural landscape, things, as you know, trees take time. But that's the great balancing act that we have. There's some really great benefits of bringing trees to the farm. Next slide, please. So I just want to kind of give a little bit of context. We're in an area of, Great Barrington's an area in Massachusetts where there's been a long presence of Native American culture and presence. And it's really important to acknowledge that Great Barrington is located on the lands of the Mohegan. And they spoke a dialect of Mohegan, which is part of the Eastern Algonquin language group. And the reason why I bring this up is not just because it's important to recognize the lands that Great Barrington sits on, but it's also important to recognize that agroforestry is being informed, the science is being informed and guided from indigenous and native land and native peoples. That is really what's driving some of the science in agroforestry, because it's been practiced for thousands of years on the landscape. You know, agroforestry is a term that really is something new. It came about in the 1970s, and it's generally what we consider somewhat of a new term for the most part. But it's important to recognize that agroforestry is by no means new. The term is new, but in terms of practice on the landscape, it's not. So indigenous and native peoples all over the world utilize a variety of techniques to manage their environment. And commonly here eastern North America and the northeastern part of the United States, it was commonly coppicing of trees, using fire, and other methods to kind of manage animal, plant, and fungi. So, you can look back in some of the Northern Africa systems, the HASA system that's been around for thousands of years, which hopefully Jeff will talk about a little bit more intently in the civil pasture talk. But to be clear, there's indications that it was practiced in China 4,000 years ago. There's clear evidence in the Mediterranean and Western and Eastern Europe, as well as North Africa, northern parts of Africa. And it's really been critically part of our existence as humans. And we're just kind of here in North America, we're really kind of rediscovering it. Next, please. So how did we kind of get to this point where trees became part of the agricultural landscape? It was really due to, the Dust Bowl. But if I could give you a reading assignment, this is what stimulated my interest as a young man before I went to college, which is this Tree Crops, A Permanent Agriculture by J. Russell Smith that was first printed in 1929. And it came out aptly, unfortunately, timed right when the great dust storms are starting in the Prairie area of the United States. And I'd love to go into a whole history of agroforestry, and because history is very much a passion of mine as well. But in its simplest terms, we understand the human and environmental disaster that the dust storms of the 1930s represented, and that inherently everything that we do as foresters, as farmers, is really about the soil. And and we're even finding out more and more about what goes on underground, between the communication between trees to the amount of carbon that's being stored in the soil. And this is a really kind of a new area of exploration for research. So there's so much we don't know that goes on underneath the ground, and there's so much in terms of the biology that we're still learning every day. And so really the first agroforestry practices was born out of this humanitarian and environmental economic disaster from the 30s with the Dust Bowl, was windbreaks. And that was the idea that we should consider taking trees and bringing them into a landscape, albeit that landscape did not have trees. All right, let's recognize that was a native grass prairie. But due to our agricultural use of that area and taking those warm season grasses, those native grasses that were deep rooted and were able to withstand all the things Mother Nature could throw at them in that climate, long periods of drought, and they were able to hold the soil there. But when that vegetation was removed to plant annual crops, that protection was lost. So shortly after the Dust Bowl occurred and the dust storms, there was the Prairie State's Forestry project was started, which was a project started by the Soil Conservation Service. And if you can imagine this, and this kind of speaks to maybe some of the messaging that we'll get to a little bit later, is that in a very short amount of time, less than a decade, 19,000 miles of trees were planted as windbreaks on over 30,000 farms. And that was from North Dakota to Texas. And that, I think, represents the response that was necessary at that time. And if you can think about what we're needing to respond to currently here in 2021 and moving forward, I think that type of response, if not more, is probably going to be necessary for us to take on the challenge of climate. Next, please. So, if we can think about it on the landscape, agroforestry, presents a fairly idyllic picture. And we know that this isn't real life, obviously, but if we could imagine the practices of agroforestry on the landscape, where we have silvopasture, where we have alley cropping, riparian buffer strips, windbreaks, you know, agroforestry is really a niche that fits to address a specific problem on the farm. That's what it is there to do. It's not there to guide the farmer. It's not there to do anything besides fix problems, and also to provide a little bit more resilience and a little bit more diversity in terms of what's coming in as a product to the farmer. So, you know, I think next slide. So that long introduction gets us really to kind of the nuts and bolts of why we're here, and kind of at least providing at least a somewhat understanding and introduction to agroforestry. And we're going to spend primarily our discussion here on temperate. There is a whole other discipline of agroforestry, tropical agroforestry, which is in and of itself is such a wonderful subject, but we're not going to get into that here because we're in a temperate zone. And really the 6 recognized practices of agroforestry, and we've just added one. So if I had this talk, if I was giving this talk maybe last year even, urban food forests would not have been on the list. So we're going to go through these 5 practices. I'm going to give you a little bit of what I see on the landscape, a little bit of my experience. Again, you know, my focus has always been on riparian buffers and windbreaks. I know a little bit to be dangerous on silvopasture, and I'm getting a little bit better at alley cropping. So I'm hoping to get at least 3 of the 6 under my belt. But I would say that if we could kind of summarize and think of agroforestry, it really represents, you know, an economically viable, a socially responsible, and an environmentally sound option for farmers. Next. So we have a definition, which is in its simplest terms is crops with trees, or agriculture with trees. But we need a way to kind of set up a criteria to understand, okay, is somebody practicing, or am I setting up a practice of agroforestry? And we use these criteria, these 4 criteria, the 4 I's, as a way to understand when we're developing these different solutions to problems on the farm. Is it agroforestry? Are we actually practicing agroforestry, or are we doing something else? And there's no good or bad to that. It's just, if we're going to call it agroforestry, we need to know that it is agroforestry, and that's what we're practicing, versus say another type of conservation practice. Next, please. So, you know, the practices fit within a specific landowner objective. This is driven by the landowner and the farmer. And the farmer is, as with all farmers, they have different objectives. And like I said, this agroforestry practice really fits a niche within the farm, and is there to hopefully help solve some problems for the farmer. So I don't want to necessarily go into great detail here, but I do want to talk about one thing that I see on the ground with the criteria that is sometimes a little bit difficult for some folks to wrap their heads around. And that's the interactive piece. And the interactive piece is difficult on many levels, because you're moving from a mono crop, say, or a specific objective on the farm where, you know, you're growing a specific food product or animal product, and now you're adding this perennial system into that. And it's very difficult at times to overcome this idea that, well, now I have to manage more than just the animal or the crop or what have you. So I think that's the most difficult hurdle for most people to kind of wrap in their brain, is that I am doing this, but I'm also doing it because it's yielding multiple products on the farm. It's not still just growing an animal, or it's still not just growing corn. I'm actually planting trees there that are providing some environmental benefit and resolving some issue that we have on the farm, but I'm also hopefully planting that tree planting or shrub planting or what have you to meet another option, another revenue stream, another diverse product that can be grown on the farm. Next, please. So we're going to go through these 6 practices on agroforestry, and I'll kind of frame it in a way where, hopefully it fits here a little bit in Berkshire County. So with alley cropping, my experience where I see it most relevant is in places where there's existing orchard or Christmas trees. And in some cases it can be an existing agricultural land as well, but I think that those are the places that is the low-hanging fruit. So where we have existing orchards, where we have existing Christmas tree farms, is there an opportunity when, say, we're replanting a portion of the orchard or replanting Christmas trees, can we just rethink the row spacing to add an annual crop into that alley? And to be honest with you, I think it makes good economic sense, because we know the lifetime it takes to grow a Christmas tree, generally, lowest 7 years, but you're really looking 9 to 11, depending on what you're growing, balsam or Fraser fir or others. So you're dealing with a long time horizon, as with any tree crop. And is there a way to offset that long investment period with something annual? So those are the low-hanging fruit. And I think those are great opportunities. Out in Worcester County, where I work, we are seeing a lot of cultivation of Christmas trees, and slowly but surely, I think this messaging is getting there. It's getting there where I've actually seen now pumpkins in between Christmas trees. So there is an opportunity there. I just think we just, as I said at the very beginning, it is an interdisciplinary approach. It isn't just about me, the forester, or just the farmer. It's really about this cross-pollination of, there's somebody that's been working on the land forever, knows everything about their land and about their farm. And how can we take that, all that great knowledge, and now provide some opportunity with something like a tree or a shrub that produces some other crop for the farmer. All right, next. So, the benefits for alley cropping, really, it comes down to, you're going to hear this quite a bit with many of the practices of agroforestry. It does provide additional diversity, additional wildlife and pollinator habitat. But it also, you're creating a microclimate. Whenever you plant a tree or a shrub, you are changing that system. And I think we need to sometimes not forget about that, is that because of the shade, because of the root biomass underground, because of the different microbes that are associated with tree and shrub roots, this changes everything that is going on within probably 8 to 10 feet or more of that tree or shrub being planted. So, and as we move down the line, we'll see that shade can be a critically important piece to what we do. So forest farming, Jeff Jourdain, I'd love, I know he's speaking about silvopasture, but Jeff is really given me a lot of information with regard to forest farming, and I'd probably say that most of what I know about forest farming probably comes from Jeff. I did a little bit of that in Kentucky, mostly around ginseng, because that is kind of the money crop where I was in Kentucky, and continues so. And typically here in Massachusetts, you see quite a bit in the firewood maple sap. But you'll see golden seal, you'll see the cohoshes, black and blue cohosh being cultivated. I think we all recognize that there's so much medicine that we still have undiscovered that is growing in the forest. I think there's obviously been large-scale use of the forest and what grows in the forest as our own pharmaceutical place for hundreds upon hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. So I think you're seeing people get back into that. There's clearly a trend moving in that direction with the supplementation and a variety of other tinctures and other effects, dried roots and so forth that are commonly being used. Next, please. So, you know, realistically, what we call the non-traditional or non-timber forest products, you know, it really, you know, diamond willow, which is something when I worked up in Alaska that was quite commonly used and collected, you know, but realistically, you know, where I was living here in Berkshire County up in Peru, quite often we were wildly collecting gold thread for digestive issues and doing a lot of balsam collection for bows and wreaths and so forth. But you know, there's a variety of other opportunities to kind of diversify your farm, and a lot of times these things are, you know, they occur when you're collecting them, especially woody florals. They're happening in a time when the farm is a little bit more quiet, so it is timed well. It's usually after the fall harvest. So think of things like if you were collecting woody florals from, say, red twig dogwood or yellow twig dogwood, something that easily could be planted in an alley cropping system or other type of system, but you could also have it naturally occurring in your forest as well. So next, please. There's great opportunity. I think it's definitely underutilized in terms of its use, but I think you're seeing popularity increase more and more. I'd say for the most common that I get exposed to, it's usually a landowner or farmer that has an existing wild population that they're looking to enhance, right? So they have golden seal on the property, or they have bloodroot, or they have some other plant that they're looking at cohosh. They're looking to help stimulate better growth in their existing forest. So that's the most common use. The next common one is probably the wild simulated, which is really just collecting seed and then planting it in the forest soil and waiting that period of time for that to develop. But you'll see that wood cultivated, that I see that more kind of down south, to be honest with you. I don't see much of it here in New England. However, it is a little bit more intensive, and it may work for some landowners who have, you know, smaller holdings. And I think that's the great flexibility about forest farming, is it can happen on very small plots of land. It can happen as small as 1/10 of an acre, and you can go as large as you want. So there is great flexibility there. It doesn't have to be, you know, 100 acres of woods for it to be profitable. So here's kind of where I got my start in agroforestry, and I still think it's probably one of our best tools to help with water quality, in my opinion, and also help with addressing some issues with other, you know, environmental issues on the farm when it comes to kind of mitigating water and or chemical issues on the farm. So riparian buffers, typically, if you were going to paint a perfect picture of a perfectly executed riparian buffer, you're looking at one that has 3 zones, preferably a tree zone, or really 4. You have an unmanaged zone within probably 0 to 10 feet of the bank, and then 10 feet out from, you know, 10 feet to say, you know, 30 feet is a tree zone, and then a shrub zone, and then ideally, I'm a big native warm season grass guy, so I'd love to see the closest zone to the crops being grasses personally, just because of the benefit that they can do in terms of removing chemicals, especially herbicides and especially atrazine, and the denitrification that they can do. So that would be my dream. But really, you can see that the benefits that riparian buffers can bring, you can really do it in less than 30 feet. Right, in terms of addressing habitat and some bank stability. Next, please. So I would say that I'm going to throw a little bit of some terminology that you may or may not be aware of. If you're aware of how streams are ordered in terms of, small streams are generally what we consider stream order 1 to 3 approximately. That's those small streams, which account for about 90% of the length in a watershed. Those small order streams, 1 to 3 order streams, have our best ability to improve water quality. So if we're looking to improve water quality, those smaller streams really should be our focus if they're in a situation where they're being cultivated right up to the edge or grazed right up to the edge. Those, we're looking to improve water quality, that's where I would focus our efforts. Stream order 3 to 6, which is kind of these medium-sized streams. If we're looking to improve wildlife habitat, that's probably our best offer right there with riparian buffers, is those medium-sized streams really, because of their velocity, because of in general, the amount of coarse woody debris that can be lodged there from other storm events and so forth, that really can provide some great stream structure along with the riparian buffer planting that can really address some critical habitat needs. And then the larger streams, the 6 order plus, which is what we see here. These are fairly large streams here in looks like Missouri. Those large order streams, that's really where if we're going to implement riparian buffers, that's where we can do our flood mitigation and help offset some of that. So in a kind of a long-winded way, is that riparian buffers fit a specific niche. So if a landowner is expressing or farmer is expressing, well, I have flooding issues, it's good to ascertain at that point, what type of stream are we talking about? Are we talking about these larger order streams, or are we talking a smaller order stream because of practices previously and because the banks are worn down? That's what's causing the flooding issues. So I think we have to recognize and understand the system that we're trying to help and to provide. But I'd say where I think our greatest opportunity here is to recognize that with many of these practices, there's an ideology that we're taking land out of production, and that's true. However, that land that comes out of production, if it's thoughtfully laid out and designed, the agroforestry practice that is that you're actually going to be adding value because you're now adding another crop to your farm. And I'll show you some other, when we get to the windbreaks, I think you'll recognize the importance of trees and their importance to improving yield. So silval pasture, we're going to kind of glaze over this a little bit. 100%, this is probably the first thing I always get engaged about. And as you'll find out a little bit later, there's a reason for that, because Massachusetts is primarily forest. And most of the farms here in Massachusetts have a fairly large amount of woods associated with them. So silval pasture is even more complex than even these other agroforestry practices, because we're adding another element to this. We're adding the animal element. So not only do we have the trees, and we have now the forage, but now we're adding this animal layer. So, let's make no bones about it, agroforestry is not easy. It's very intensive, as the criteria would explain to you. So realistically, here in Massachusetts, you're gonna see, in most cases, commonly is where you're taking existing forest and managing that to bring in the forb layer and then bring in your animals. That's typically the process. Next, please. So where I see the benefits mostly, and it's probably more in a forage forage benefit is that orchard grass can grow it can be more productive in under 50% shade than it can be out in the open sun. All right, and that's one of the benefits, is that depending on the forage that you're using in your silvopasture system, but you're going to see much better persistence with legumes under a shaded forest, under a shaded condition. Orchard grass better performs in shaded conditions. And then you also have that the cool season grasses inherently start growing earlier in the season than an open field, than an open pasture, and they grow later into the fall under tree cover. So not only are you inherently adding additional land to your base by now managing your forest for silvopasture, you're also creating a longer pasture period to bring the animals out, because now you're opened up extra window in the spring and an extra window in the fall. And you're also, depending on your four makeup and what you use, if you're using legumes and you're using orchard grass, there's clear yield increases when grown under shade. And you know, to be honest with you, the reason why silvopasture has gotten so much kind of acknowledgement is you're also making the animals a little bit happier. You know, the stress level of these animals goes way down when they do have some shade. And also the trees, if you're managing it in a silvopasture situation, you have a better manure distribution versus an open pasture condition. So windbreaks, another one of mine that I think is got some great opportunity here in Massachusetts and even probably New England in general. So windbreaks, really, think of it as like a riparian buffer, but in an upland for the most part. So, you know, you're generally doing either 1 to 3 rows of plantings. They can include a variety of things. It could be trees, it can be grass only. You know, so there, you know, you can just use grass trap strips. You know, typically that's used in advance of planting trees or shrubs. But you can, I've seen plenty of farmers just use warm season grass trap strips that work quite effectively. You know, they don't provide the yield advantage than say trees and shrub zone does. However, they do provide some windbreak advantages. So, so to talk about really the yield aspect of this. So yes, you're taking ground out of production because you're planting trees in what was previously row crop or hay or pasture. But because of that microclimate that the trees present and that wind effect that gets broken up on the leeward side of the windbreak, the research there's probably not an agroforestry practice that has more research behind it than windbreaks, because it's obviously our longest lived agroforestry practice. So for instance, crop yield increases. So mind you, these yield increases are also calculating that the land has been taken out of production as well. So this is on top of the land being taken out of production. So for corn in a windbreak system, you're looking at a 12% increase in yield, barley 25%, hay 20%, soybeans 13%, winter wheat 23%, and spring wheat 8%. And those yield increases are really about as the wind gets broken up by that windbreak. There's this zone. Obviously, you're going to see it. You know, you guys know, right next to where the windbreak is, that's going to be lost production. You know that, right? Because of as with all agroforestry systems, you're managing competition because you're introducing a perennial cropping system adjacent to an annual cropping system, and there's root competition. You know, you go to any pasture or any hayfield and look at the impact that tree roots have on that system, right? We all recognize that. Even with that land being taken out of production and the root competition from that windbreak, you're still seeing dramatic increases in yield because of that microclimate change. And it's so remarkable to see when you see if you've ever seen them out in the Midwest, where you can see on these flat plain, these flat fields where it's clear, you can see what the effect, because the height of the crop is higher, and then it starts to drop off once the windbreak effect, which is generally, you're going to see that windbreak effect, the positive effect on yield within 5 to 10 times the height of that windbreak. So all right, so urban food forests. It's not necessarily new terminology to me. However, it is a new practice under agroforestry, and I think we can all recognize there's clear crossover between some agroforestry, depending on scale, to permaculture, and to be honest with you, where I live and where I do some gardening and so forth, it's probably more, it's definitely permaculture, it's not agroforestry, because definitely not looking at the 4 eyes in terms of its criteria. So Boston's been great. They've established a number of food forests, urban food farms, and obviously Holyoke, I think, is a great example. Is kind of probably the genesis of many of that permaculture movement here in Massachusetts. So I do think it speaks to the urban food forest, speaks to some of it, brings in a little bit of the conversation of tropical agroforestry, which has elements of land tenure to it, right? Has women's rights issues, so there's different things that tropical agroforestry address that I won't say we don't have here in the United States or in the temperate zone, but it's just a little different. So land ownership is different, and having land tenure, and there's specific things that like the shade tree. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the shade tree and shea butter and all that. That's a woman-dominated agricultural system in Africa, and so there's a variety of things, but you're seeing that kind of tropical agroforestry ideology in terms of land tenure and environmental justice, these things that we have vocabulary for here in this country, and you're seeing it being addressed through this urban food forest. So I have not been directly involved with any. I would love to be, but I think this is a great opportunity, especially where you can look at areas where there's food deserts, there's environmental justice issues, there's land tenure issues, there's lack of open space, there's lack of having a place where you can go, even if it's very small, a place where you can go and wildly collect some fruits, and I think that's, if you look at some of the research, fruit is a very difficult thing to kind of find in some inner city. So that's blues. So, I think we're looking at this urban food forest, and to be honest with you, it's probably going to require, again, another interdisciplinary kind of approach where, I'm not sure how much of a forester is going to be directly kind of involved in these conversations, but clearly the permaculture world, clearly the urban forester, and the planning and government really needs to get uncomfortable for a little bit and get outside of where they're maybe the most comfortable. And instead of looking at, a playground, maybe there's something additional that can go on with the playground. Maybe there's a small area that could be rehabilitated into an urban food forest. So, I think the one cautionary tale is that in many of these urban settings, we do have some contaminated soil issues. So we need to we need to recognize that and do our due diligence to make sure that we're not growing food that is inherently toxic because of the soil that it's growing in. So in terms of here in Massachusetts, and I think, you know, I think as you kind of work and live here in Massachusetts, you realize that Massachusetts is definitely, next slide, is definitely not the norm. And it is unique. Massachusetts is. And it really comes down to kind of what our landscape is dominated by, and that's forest. So we are in a state where it's dominated by forest. We do have a good amount of farms still. We got about 500,000 acres of farms across the state. And, you know, remarkably, just in a similar fashion, is the farmer has a lot of woods too. So, you know, almost, you know, over 50% of the farms have forests associated with them. And, you know, that's, in terms of the acreage across the state, that represents almost 40% of the acres on a farm. So is there a way to now bridge this agricultural and forest divide, really? Next slide. And, you know, so that this is just some census data from 2017. And I think it gives us a good picture, you know, where I work in Worcester County. You know, we've seen a lot of farms actually lost, unfortunately, over time, but we still have a very good amount of farm and robust farming, as well as Berkshire and Franklin and Plymouth County. But, you know, I'd like, if I was going to give you one thing, is that, you know, we're not Nebraska and we're not Iowa. You know, we're New England. And if we were having this conversation 150 years ago, when we were just coming out of mass land clearing and forest clearing, when the majority of the landscape was open, you know, we'd probably have a different conversation. But we're in a landscape now that's dominated by forest, and we need to find a way to work within that to support our needs for food, primarily at a regional level. And we also need to find ways to not actually, you know, go back to that time period where we're clearing land again. So is there a way to work in a symbiotic way with the forest? Next, please. So, you know, the other item here in Massachusetts is we're dealing, you know, we have small farms, just like we have small forests, you know, so the average size of a forest is actually even less than that. It's about 40 acres across the state, and it's shrinking quite rapidly, actually. So, but, you know, we're not dealing with huge farms. Most farms, and the farmer is usually, you know, a majority of farmers are working off the farm as well to support that lifestyle that they have chosen. And, you know, so as you can see, you know, the farm is small, and if you take 40% of 68 acres, and, you know, 40% of that is forest, you know, you can see how you know, how constrained you are as a farmer in terms of trying to find additional ways to kind of create diversity for production economically. And I'll just tell you, just growing, you know, this year was really difficult. Many of the farmers that I spoke to, in terms of folks that were haying, you know, got one cut. You know, so can the trees help with that? You know, and I would argue that there's a chance that they can. There's a chance that you now have an additional product to fall back on when we have these we're entering these uncertain climate times where we really cannot predict normal weather patterns anymore. And can trees and shrubs create some cushioning for when I can only get one cutting of hay? And is there a tree fodder that I can now supplement to my animal that comes from the forest, right? So I think that those conversations are going to need to be had, because the weather's only going to get, and the climate's only going to get a little bit more difficult to navigate. So, you know, where I see our probably, as I said, silvopasture is probably the most common thing that's brought up to me. I think mainly because we like protein, and I think farmers recognize that they need to add some acres, and instead of trying to scramble and find hay and trying to find additional grazing land, when they already have the potential, if they think through it, they already have the acres in place, if well managed, to meet some of their needs. So I think my messaging is that we're seeing a good uptick. You know, we've gone from 59 people self-reporting using alley cropping and silvopasture up to 299. It's still only 7% of the farms. However, you know, we have some great opportunity where people are already using the woods for their animals. And it's not in a silvopasture system. It's what we would consider unmanaged woodland grazing. And unmanaged woodland grazing is really the exact opposite of what we're trying to achieve with silvopasture. So unmanaged woodland grazing, not only are we not really doing well by the animal, we surely aren't doing well by the forest, because we're creating, in many cases, root damage, tree damage, and inherently creating issues with overall forest health. But we're also damaging the soil because we're not implementing our rotational grazing methodology in terms of what we're doing in the woods. So if I was going to wave a magic wand, this is again, when we talk about low-hanging fruit, this is a place where we can make some huge impacts, not just environmentally, but we can also make some great impacts locally with much better locally sourced protein. And I'll just say that there's a woman, a farmer that I work with up in Westminster in Ashburnham. And our family gets all our protein from her farm. And it's Wildwood Farm in Westminster. Gretchen Foster's the farmer. And she has started using silvopasture as a practice on her farm. So I'm proud to say that some of the, you know, the half a side of beef that we get every year from Gretchen is some of that is raised on silvopasture. So that's I think there's great opportunity there. So how do we get there? Part of it is what I'm doing today, and hopefully that messaging. There's some great work being done out in, you know, in parts of Franklin County where there's some chestnuts being planted. There's a lot of great, thoughtful farmers that are starting to think about how to bring trees back into their farming system and as a way to diversify their farm. So really it comes down to, it can't just be me talking. There needs to be other people talking about it. There needs to be clearly this kind of peer-to-peer, and we need more demonstration of these practices on the ground here in Massachusetts. And, you know, and that will hopefully start to move towards becoming more aware. And then, you know, we're hopefully see it wider adoption on the farm. You know, agroforestry is not going to fix everything. It's there to fix specific problems on the farm, and it's there to fit certain niches on the farm as well. But, you know, just like planting trees isn't going to get us out of this climate issue, agroforestry isn't either. All right, it's going to take an interdisciplinary approach and understanding that when we plant trees specifically for a specific purpose, that eventually that those benefits that will be brought to the farm through improved water quality, you know, wildlife habitat, and some additional products that, you know, maybe we haven't been growing on the farm yet. So it really comes down to, you know, biases, and that's really I'll just tell you my experience. This cartoon probably depicts my experience in Kentucky. I spent years upon years in Kentucky fencing animals out of the woods. That was the practice, you know, and it was for good reason, because a lot of the unmanaged grazing that was going on in the woods was really detrimental to the forest. But how about if instead of spending that money fencing the animals out, providing the necessary technical assistance to get silvopasture established? I think we would have made much better impact on the farm. I think economically for the farmer, but also much better for the animal, if we didn't fence them out of the woods and actually practiced silvopasture. So, you know, I've been on both sides, and you know, I've worked with farmers to fence animals out of the woods, and in some cases that was very good. But I honestly wish some of that money would have went to let's see if we can get some productivity out of this forest for the farmer, because they have a specific objective as well. It's not just about the trees, and that's really what it comes down to. So,
can I ask a question? Like this, somebody from the chat wants to know, and you're maybe getting to this, the role and purpose of the mass service foresters in the state. What kind of services are available, and how do you help farmers adopt these practices?
great question. So the service forester, you know, our role dates back to the beginnings of the office of the state forester. So we're there as, in some states, think of it as an extension agent. And we're not part of the UMass extension system, obviously, but we're there to provide the necessary technical assistance to help landowners work through different things they want to, you know, try to achieve on their property. So our services are always free. You know, we're really there to, as a sounding board, you know, so, you know, in many cases, we'll meet with a landowner to talk about, you know, well, we have these animals on our place, and we have them in the woods now, but is this a good thing? Are we doing something good, or is this bad? And we're really not there to say it's good or bad. We're probably there more to say, you know, have you thought about moving your animals? You know, instead of just, here's the woods for you, and you're there from, you know, winter through summer. And, you know, so realistically, we serve kind of a dual purpose. We're there mainly as a resource, as a technical assistance resource. We work, you know, when the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, occasionally will bring us in for conversations, especially when there's trees and agriculture being talked about. So I think that's, again, it speaks to the interdisciplinary approach that agroforestry requires. I can't show up and talk about animals because I'm not an animal guy. I can talk a little bit, somewhat intellectually, about cool season grasses and warm season grasses, because I have a little bit of that background, but not every forester does. And to say that I'm an expert on, you know, pasture management, you know, that's ridiculous. So, you know, that's why it's important to have, you know, if you're bringing trees into the farm, I think a forester is a good point of contact to have. It's a good resource to tap into. We don't know everything, and we're not, you know, we're not experts in terms of farmers, because we're not farmers. But you know, I think there are certain attributes that we have, you know, especially if you look at windbreaks and planting windbreaks and planting riparian buffers and species to plant, and thinking about it in terms of, you know, not just the conservation practice of planting trees to protect water, right? But to think more holistically, okay, what else can I do besides, I know I'm protecting the water by doing this, but is there a product there that can help with the farm? And I think that those are some of the conversations that I enjoy. But you know, our services are free, and you know, whatever we can do to be helpful to folks, that's really kind of, you know, where we are. But in terms of, you know, where agroforestry is lacking, and this is across the United States, across North America, adoption rates are atrocious. All right. So with agroforestry, we have to get better if you know, in terms of providing the economics picture about yields, about, you know, how long is it, you know, if I plant trees, how long does it take for me to recuperate that money that I invested? You know, the reality is farmers understand that if it doesn't pay, why would I do it? Right? So, you know, so there's a lot of help out there to get the economics right, so you're not making a bad decision on the farm. And also, more importantly, not making a bad decision economically on the farm, but not making a bad decision for specific objectives on the farm. So there's a ton of economic analysis. There's if you go to the Center for Agroforestry, there's some great Excel spreadsheets that you can plug in a variety of inputs that are specifically geared for your specific farm. And it will tell you in 3 years, if you invest $3,000 to do alley cropping with planting these specific trees and bushes and so forth, and the cost of doing that, when can you expect that to pay off? And I think that is the first step into understanding, you know, where we got to go to next, because, you know, and this is nothing against government, because I work for government, but these practices have to stand on their own. The government cannot provide the incentive for these. This has to pay for itself, these practices. And I can't stress that enough, is that, but the information's there. We have the economic backing, we have the yield information, we have the productivity, we have all the facts and figures. And that's where, you know, please tap into, you know, others that are doing it in Massachusetts, as well as tap into some of that information that's available, where you can plug in your specific farm finances and know, well, it's going to pay off in 30 years, and who's going to do a practice that pays off in 30. So, you know, every farm is different. So, you know, we got to move towards this. This is, you know, if we think that agroforestry is part of the solution for our food system, if we think that it has a fit here in Massachusetts because of the way we're currently farming and the current way the landscape is shaped up with being dominated by forest, so how do we work within that system? And, you know, it really comes down to, next slide, please. It really comes down to getting the demonstrations and the adoption. And, you know, I think, you know, feel free to contact me at any point. You know, I think some of the resources that are available, especially through the Center for Agroforestry, which is through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the University of Missouri at Columbia, and the National Agroforestry Center out of Nebraska. Those are, you know, really some great resources. They have the economic spreadsheets if you want to be able to figure out, you know, things are going to pay or not going to pay. Next, please. So here's a few agroforestry farms that I've been fortunate enough to visit over my time. Many of them are in New York State, but we do have a few and here in Massachusetts that are trying. And I know there's more. I know there's the chestnut folk that I haven't yet to get to meet, but I'm looking forward to getting out to see their farm someday. Up in Covington, and then there's the other one, I forget, I think it's down in East Hampton, maybe. So there's plenty of farms that are probably practicing it that I don't know about, but I'd love to see and get more experience, because I'm learning every day about this, and it's pretty wild. Please. Thank you.
So I think we have some questions maybe from the audience or from the chat. So we have
Okay.
a couple minutes for questions, if you don't mind.
Cool.
one from. Question from the Great Barrington Agricultural Commission, wanting to know if they could contact you in the future since Great Barrington starts their food system planning in January. Vivian, if you want to clarify your question, I think that's the question, is if Michael could be in contact in the future.
Any excuse I can get out to Great Barrington again, yes, of course. I'd welcome it. I welcome a conversation, whatever you know, as I said, I'm not an expert. There's certain things that I have a lot of experience with, but there's clearly things that I know nothing about too. So, but I you know, whatever help I can bring to the table for Great Barrington, please. I think my contact information I put up somewhere. So,
And if not, feel free to contact me and I'll pass it along.
Anyone here want to ask a question? Yeah.
When you were talking earlier, the concept of a carbon market, whether any of that monetization of trees is coming into that one.
well, I think you're going to see it here shortly in Massachusetts, no doubt. I think you see those rumblings, and I do think that you'll see that opportunity because, you know, as we know, is once you start providing that kind of monetary system for the sequestration and storage piece, you know, I think there's great opportunity, especially on the farm, right? So yeah, there's examples of that in other parts of the world. In Europe, obviously, you're seeing it in Switzerland, you're seeing it in other parts of Eastern Europe, where there's a little bit more of a kind of well-defined carbon trading market versus here where we're kind of relegated to just the California folk. But you're seeing trees entering in some of those systems in Eastern Europe now on some of those farms. So, and that's, I think the primary driver of that is because they're getting, you know, renewable, you know, they're getting those carbon credits for that practice. So yeah, definitely, you'll see it. I think you'll be here very quickly, to be honest with you.
Okay, one last question. Do you help farmers navigate NRCS cost share programs?
So NRCS, I'm very familiar with them. Generally, NRCS covers their own business in terms, but you know, if you need to, you know, have a conversation about some of the opportunities through NRCS, obviously the service forester can speak to those, but generally the application process, the U.S. Department of Agriculture will walk you through that. And if, you know, if you're looking for specific agroforestry practices, there's a few missing, unfortunately, as well. But we're working closely with the NRCS to maybe diversify their portfolio for what is cost shared through for agroforestry through NRCS.
All right, so I want to thank Michael for your presentation. Thank you all for coming, and for you on Zoom, we're gonna switch to Jeff Jordan in about 10 minutes or so. So we'll welcome you back at that point. So thank you all. Thanks a lot, Michael.
Thank you.
And feel free to contact me or to get in touch with Michael directly.
Thank you.
Wonderful. We'll hear more from Jeff.
All right, yeah, Jeff will get you. No doubt.